You are bound not by what happened to you but by the role you learned to perform so that love would not be withdrawn. This is not a metaphor. It is a psychic contract signed in silence long before language matured. When approval was oxygen and withdrawal felt like annihilation. You did not decide to become accommodating, vigilant, explanatory, or endlessly receptive. The psyche decided for you in the way the body decides to clot around a wound. What you call kindness is often an adaptation to conditional belonging. What you call empathy is frequently a vigilance refined by fear. And what you call love has been shaped by an early calculation. Remain acceptable, remain necessary, remain useful, or disappear. I see the scene with a precision that no abstraction can soften. A kitchen table at dusk. The day already spent. The air heavy with unsaid things. Someone asks a question that is not a question. You begin to explain yourself before you are accused. Your voice lowers. Your words round themselves to avoid edges. You offer context, justification, apology, even when no crime has been named. Or it is a phone call that tightens the chest before it rings. A holiday gathering where your body enters first and your soul follows later, cautious scanning. In these moments, the old empath is not loving. The old empath is negotiating survival. This is the first cruelty of the unconscious. It disguises compulsion as virtue. The child who learned that love arrived with conditions did not rebel. Rebellion would have meant exile. Instead, the child became perceptive, sensitive to shifts in mood, attuned to what was expected but never spoken. Father and mother were not merely people. They were gods whose favor ensured existence. From them arose complexes that still rule the adult life with an authority far greater than conscious intention. You do not choose your reactions. They erupt. You do not decide when to explain. You explain because something ancient tightens inside and the tightening demands appeasement. There is a fatigue that comes from this which sleep does not touch. It is the fatigue of living as an emissary rather than a source. Over time, resentment accumulates not because you give, but because the giving is compelled. Identity thins. Authority drains. You begin to feel unreal as though you exist slightly to the side of your own life, watching yourself perform reliability, understanding, patience. The psyche repeats what it has not resolved. And so the same relational geometry appears again and again with different faces but identical gravity. You believe you are choosing familiar people. In truth, you are being chosen by the same pattern, wearing new clothes. In the blackened phase of this work, there is no consolation. The truth is brutal because it must be. The old empath survives by betraying the self in small, socially rewarded ways. Each concession seems minor. Each explanation appears reasonable, but together they form a lattice that imprisons vitality. You begin to feel older than your years, not with wisdom, but with depletion. The shadow grows dense here. Anger, envy, and contempt are pressed down because they threaten the image of goodness that once secured belonging. What is repressed does not vanish. It waits. There is an image that appears often in dreams at this stage. A house with too many rooms. Some locked, some forgotten, some occupied by strangers who behave as if they own the place. The dreamer wanders searching for a central room but finds only corridors. This is the psyche under possession by role. The persona has inflated beyond its task and the self has retreated as it always does when it is not welcomed. You believe the house is your identity. It is only your adaptation. Outside, night gathers. Frost settles on pine needles. The air carries that particular stillness that comes before snowfall when sound seems absorbed by the ground. There is no instruction here, only the fact of cold and the slow, patient breath of the forest. You believed your exhaustion meant you were doing something wrong. But the psyche was actually signaling the cost of an unconscious agreement that could no longer be paid. This is the first turn, and it rarely arrives gently. Fatigue becomes chronic. The body resists situations the mind insists are harmless. Illness appears without clear cause. The mechanism is simple and merciless. A complex demands energy to maintain the role, and the organism begins to ration. The price is paid in vitality. At this point, many cling more tightly to the role, mistaking collapse for moral failure. They become even more understanding, more patient, more accommodating. The old gods are fed more offerings, not fewer, but the offerings no longer suffice. What once ensured belonging now drains life. This is the repetition compulsion tightening its grip. The psyche circling the same wound in the hope that this time the outcome will differ. There is a myth that belongs here, though it is rarely recognized as such. Persephone does not descend because she is weak. She descends because the earth itself requires a cycle that consciousness resists. She eats the seeds not out of ignorance but because something older than intention draws her. The descent is not punishment. It is necessity. So too with this phase, the psyche must go dark to loosen the false light that has governed it. Ash gathers in the furnace where meaning once burned clean. Salt stings the eyes. Iron creaks as if under strain. These are not poetic ornaments. They are the materials of psychic transformation. What has been overused must be reduced. What has been idealized must be broken down. There is grief here. And it is not theatrical. It is the grief of realizing that much of what you called love was fear and ceremonial dress. You believed your empathy made you safe, but the psyche was actually using sensitivity as an early warning system in an environment where displeasure carried danger. The consequence is subtle and severe. You feel responsible for other people's moods as though they were weather you must manage. The mechanism is projection intertwined with possession. You carry what was never yours. And because you carry it well, it continues to be given to you. Another pause, if it can be called that, arrives like the hoot of an owl from somewhere beyond the firelight. The sound does not demand response. It simply marks the hour. As the old structure begins to fail, a strange light appears. It is not relief. It is clarity. You begin to see the contract you never knew you signed. Permission to exist was exchanged for compliance. Belonging was granted on the condition of usefulness. This realization does not immediately free you. It wounds, but it wounds in a way that stops infection. The psyche begins to separate image from essence. You notice how often you speak to be understood rather than to speak truth. You observe the reflex to soften what is sharp, to dilute what is real. This observation is not yet integration. It is the washing of eyes that have been long accustomed to dimness. In this whitening phase, things appear stark, almost cruel. Relationships are revealed as arrangements maintained by unconscious agreement. When the agreement falters, tensions rise, not because love has ended, but because the old economy is failing. There is a figure from Egypt who belongs here, though he is often misunderstood. Osiris is not merely killed. He is dismembered, scattered, each piece isolated. Isis does not resurrect him by denial. She gathers what has been torn apart. So too the psyche at this stage. The self that was fragmented into roles, functions, and appeasements begins to be recognized as fragmented. The work is not to become something new, but to reclaim what was distributed under pressure. You believed separation meant abandonment, but the psyche was actually seeking differentiation without which no true relation is possible. The consequence of resisting this is stagnation. The mechanism is possession by the family complex, which confuses loyalty with self-erasure. When differentiation begins, guilt flares. Guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing here. It is the alarm of a system losing control. The night deepens. Stars appear not as decoration but as cold, indifferent presences. Constellations do not arrange themselves for comfort. They exist. The psyche, when it moves toward the self, adopts this same indifference to approval. Not cruelty. Indifference. There is a danger in this phase and it must be named without embellishment. Some mistake clarity for superiority. The persona inflates again, this time under the banner of awareness. They become righteous, sharp-edged, convinced they see what others do not. This is another possession, more subtle, more flattering. True separation is quieter. It does not announce itself. It simply withdraws energy from what no longer has authority. You believed boundaries were actions you must perform. But the psyche was actually moving toward a state in which boundaries are conditions of being. The difference is absolute. Actions can be negotiated. Conditions cannot. The consequence of mistaking one for the other is endless bargaining. The mechanism behind this confusion is the lingering belief that existence must still be earned. There is an image that comes now, often unbidden, a threshold worn smooth by centuries of passage. On one side, the familiar heat of the old hearth, crowded, noisy, demanding. On the other, a colder space, sparsely furnished but intact. Crossing is not heroic. It is irrevocable. Wind moves through dry grass somewhere. A river carries ice downstream. The sound muted, persistent. No one commands the current. It follows gravity. At this juncture, something decisive occurs. The psyche ceases to ask for permission, not as rebellion, not as declaration, but as fact. Explanations diminish. Justifications fall away. Silence expands. This silence is not punishment. It is the natural atmosphere of authority returning to its seat. The family script attempts to reassert itself through old triggers: shame, obligation, fear of being misunderstood. But the triggers no longer connect. The circuit has been broken. You believed love required constant translation, but the psyche was actually preparing to speak a language that does not beg for comprehension. The consequence is loneliness of a particular kind, not empty but unshared. The mechanism is the withdrawal of projection. Others can no longer place their unmet needs into you, and so they feel a loss they cannot name. Here the red phase begins to glow faintly, not as triumph but as heat. The elements recombine. What was dismembered returns not as it was but as it can now be. Authority emerges without noise. It is recognized by its absence of urgency. The self does not argue. It does not persuade. It stands. Ash cools. Iron settles. Salt preserves. The work is not complete in the sense of finality. It is complete in the sense that the old empath, the one bound by survival contracts, has ended. What remains does not announce itself. It simply no longer kneels. It is here that many mistake the silence for absence, as though something essential has been lost. In truth, what has withdrawn is not love but compliance. The psyche, having survived long enough through adaptation, no longer requires the same disguises. What returns now is not softness but weight. You believed that being needed was proof of worth. But the psyche was actually using indispensability as a substitute for existence. The consequence was subtle self-erasure. You became valuable everywhere and present nowhere. The mechanism beneath this is role-based belonging. The family system, and later its replicas, rewarded function over being. When function ceases, panic follows. Not because the self is endangered but because the system is. This panic often arrives as a familiar dream. You are late. A train has departed. A gathering has ended without you. You search for explanations but no one is listening. The dream is not prophecy. It is diagnosis. It reveals how deeply the psyche equated participation with survival. To miss the train once meant annihilation. To miss it now is merely to discover that not every departure requires your presence. The old empath would have chased, would have called ahead, would have apologized for the delay, even if the delay was imaginary. But something different holds now. Not defiance. Gravity. The psyche senses that movement for its own sake no longer serves life. It waits, not in hope but in recognition. Night presses close against stone. Firelight reveals not faces but surfaces. Wood grain, iron edges, ash collecting where flame once leapt. There is no instruction in this scene, only endurance. You believed that withdrawal would make you cruel, but the psyche was actually separating compassion from compulsion. The consequence of not making this separation is resentment disguised as kindness. The mechanism is shadow identification. What you disown in yourself returns as irritation toward others. When the shadow is acknowledged, irritation loses its fuel. There is a biblical image that belongs to this moment, stripped of sermon and commandment. Jacob wrestles through the night not with an enemy, but with a force that refuses to name itself. He does not win by overpowering. He wins by refusing to release what has seized him until it reveals its nature. The wound he receives does not weaken him. It alters his gait. He walks differently thereafter, marked not by victory but by encounter. So too with the psyche when it disengages from the old contract. There is a limp. Not everything moves as easily. Certain gatherings feel foreign. Certain conversations lose their thread. You no longer know how to perform reassurance on cue. This is not regression. It is the cost of truth entering the body. You believed that clarity would bring peace, but the psyche was actually demanding accuracy, which is colder and far less consoling. The consequence is that illusions fall without ceremony. The mechanism is the dissolution of projection. When you no longer carry what belongs to others, you must face what remains in yourself, unadorned. Another turn comes quietly, often mistaken for failure. Relationships that relied on your responsiveness begin to falter. You are accused not openly but through atmosphere. A chill enters the room. Disappointment thickens conversations. You feel the old impulse to repair, to explain, to soften, but the impulse no longer commands the body. It arises, flickers, and passes. Snow begins to fall, not heavily but steadily. Each flake lands without announcement, altering the landscape not through force but through accumulation. You believed that love required constant availability. But the psyche was actually discovering that availability without sovereignty is intrusion. The consequence of this discovery is distance. The mechanism is the restoration of the self's boundary. Not as a wall but as skin. Skin allows contact. It also ends it. At this stage, the false god of guilt attempts a final dominion. It speaks in familiar tones. Duty, loyalty, gratitude, memory. It invokes the past as though time itself were an argument. But guilt here is no longer a moral signal. It is a residue left behind by a power that has lost its throne. The psyche recognizes it as such. The feeling arises. Authority does not follow. There is an image from Gnostic thought that clarifies this without explanation. The archons rule not through strength but through ignorance. Once seen, their dominion evaporates. They cannot be fought because they have no substance. They can only be outgrown. You believed confrontation was necessary to end old patterns. But the psyche was actually dissolving them through non-participation. The consequence is that others feel unsettled. The mechanism is simple. A hierarchy formed by unconscious agreement collapses when one party withdraws belief. No announcement is required. Wind moves through the forest again, this time carrying the scent of iron and wet earth. Somewhere a branch snaps under its own weight. Nothing rushes to explain the sound. As the red phase deepens, something paradoxical emerges. Desire returns but not as hunger. Disgust also returns but not as rejection. They stand together, no longer required to annihilate each other. The psyche tolerates tension now without rushing to resolve it. This is authority, the capacity to hold opposites without collapse. You believed that certainty was strength, but the psyche was actually cultivating tolerance for ambiguity. The consequence is fewer answers but greater stability. The mechanism is the self's refusal to be reduced to single values. Life is no longer filtered through the need to be correct. Here the old empath truly ends, though there is no ceremony. What ends is not sensitivity, not depth, not perception. What ends is the reflex to trade selfhood for safety. That trade once kept you alive. It now obstructs life. Fire burns lower. Embers glow. Heat remains but without spectacle. This is not absence. It is maturity. In this state you may be misunderstood, but misunderstanding no longer wounds. Not because you have armored yourself, but because the need to be known by everyone has dissolved. The psyche knows itself. That is sufficient. You believed the family script would always have access to you, but the psyche was actually preparing a lock that does not require keys. The consequence is quiet. The mechanism is sovereignty established not by resistance but by presence. Nothing more is added here. Nothing is promised. The work continues because life continues. But the old empath, bound to survival through self-erasure, has ended. What stands now does not explain itself. There is a moment after withdrawal when the psyche discovers that the world has not collapsed. This discovery is unsettling. For a long time, your vigilance was justified by the belief that without you holding the structure together, something essential would fail. The family, the relationship, the emotional economy, all seemed dependent on your responsiveness. When you step back and nothing shatters, a strange grief appears. Not grief for loss, but for the years spent guarding a catastrophe that never arrived. You believed your attentiveness prevented disaster, but the psyche was actually reenacting an ancient role, the child as stabilizer of the parental field. The consequence of carrying this role into adulthood is chronic hyperresponsibility. The mechanism is a parent-child complex in which the child's sensitivity becomes the regulator of adult emotion. When this mechanism dissolves, the child finally ages. This aging does not feel like growth at first. It feels like disorientation. You no longer know where to stand in familiar rooms. Conversations that once animated you now feel hollow, as though the words float without anchoring. You are not bored. You are no longer hypnotized. The spell has lifted and what remains is plain, sometimes painfully so that a dream often appears here. You are speaking, but the sound does not travel. Others continue as though you are not present. The old interpretation would have been abandonment. The psyche now understands it differently. The dream reveals the end of participation in a shared illusion. When you stop feeding it, the illusion cannot hear you. Outside, the sky clears after days of cloud. Stars sharpen. Cold intensifies. The air feels thinner, more exacting. You believed that being unseen meant being erased, but the psyche was actually learning to exist without reflection. The consequence is solitude that cannot be alleviated by company. The mechanism is the withdrawal of mirrored identity. Without others constantly confirming who you are, you must inhabit yourself directly. This is where many attempt to return to the old role. Not out of desire, but out of vertigo. The familiar exhaustion beckons like a low ceiling, uncomfortable but known. Yet something resists. The body hesitates before re-entering old patterns. The pause lengthens. A new rhythm insists. There is a Greek image that clarifies this without consolation. Orpheus descends into the underworld to retrieve what he loves. But he is forbidden to look back. His failure is not impatience. It is doubt. He turns because he does not trust the unseen. The psyche, when it moves toward the self, faces the same prohibition. Looking back to check whether the old bond still exists revives it. Authority requires that you do not confirm yourself through what you have left. You believed certainty came from reassurance. But the psyche was actually demanding trust in an inner center that does not speak often. The consequence of ignoring this demand is perpetual regression. The mechanism is the compulsion to verify belonging through external response. Another turn appears here, often masked as moral concern. You begin to worry that your withdrawal harms others. You imagine their confusion, their pain, their sense of rejection. This concern feels noble. It is also familiar. The psyche recognizes it as a refined form of control. By taking responsibility for others' emotional reactions, you maintain relevance. When this concern is released, relevance dissolves. Being remains. Wind moves through dry leaves, producing a sound like distant rain. It does not announce itself as weather. It simply passes. You believed responsibility for others' feelings was love. But the psyche was actually confusing empathy with omnipotence. The consequence is guilt whenever others experience discomfort. The mechanism is an inflated sense of agency, born in childhood when small gestures truly did affect the emotional climate of the home. In adulthood, this inflation becomes a burden. As this burden drops, anger may surface unexpectedly. Not the sharp anger of boundary violation, but a deeper, slower anger that has waited decades for recognition. This anger does not seek expression. It seeks acknowledgement. It is the guardian of vitality that was suppressed in service of harmony. When recognized, it softens not into sweetness but into firmness. There is an Egyptian image here that resists sentimentality. In the weighing of the heart, it is not emotion that condemns but excess. A heart heavy with what does not belong to it cannot pass. The psyche lightens by relinquishment, not by purification. Rituals but by refusing to carry surplus. You believed letting go would leave you empty. But the psyche was actually discarding what obscured weight. The consequence is a different density, less crowded, more exact. The mechanism is differentiation at the level of instinct. At this stage, authority no longer announces itself through speech. It manifests through timing. You respond later or not at all. You do not rush to fill silence. Silence ceases to be an accusation. It becomes a medium. Others may interpret this as withdrawal, punishment, or indifference. The psyche does not correct them. Interpretation is no longer a shared project. The night deepens again, but it is a different night than before. The fear that once accompanied darkness has thinned. What remains is respect. You believed intimacy required constant disclosure. But the psyche was actually restoring secrecy as a condition of depth. The consequence is fewer confessions but truer presence. The mechanism is the reclamation of inner space. Here the family script makes one last attempt, often through memory. Childhood scenes return with unusual clarity. A voice, a gesture, a look of disappointment or approval. These memories do not demand resolution. They present themselves as artifacts, no longer as commands. The psyche views them without reenactment. This is decisive. There is a biblical image that belongs here, freed from exaltation. Job sits in ash not to be forgiven, not to be corrected, but to endure the collapse of explanations. His integrity is not proven through obedience, but through refusal to lie about his experience. The psyche too must sit with what cannot be justified. Ash cools under the open sky. It does not scatter. It remains where fire once worked. You believed endurance meant passivity. But the psyche was actually practicing fidelity to inner truth without defense. The consequence is that accusations lose their hook. The mechanism is the separation of identity from evaluation. As the red face stabilizes, something unmistakable occurs. Choice returns not as deliberation but as inclination. You move toward what nourishes without argument. You move away from what drains without explanation. This movement is not strategic. It is instinctive. Authority has descended from the head into the body. You believed freedom would feel expansive. But the psyche experiences it as narrowing. Fewer paths attract. Fewer people engage. Life simplifies. Not into comfort but into coherence. The old empath is gone here. Though traces may flicker under pressure, what has ended is the reflexive offering of self to secure peace. What remains does not seek peace. It generates it by absence of contradiction. The fire is nearly out now, not extinguished but reduced to what is necessary. Heat persists. Light dims. The work does not announce completion. It does not need to. What remains when the old reflexes have burned down is not an improved version of the empath. It is the end of a function that was never meant to be permanent. This is difficult to accept because the role once saved your life. The psyche does not dishonor its past adaptations. It simply retires them when they become obstructive. Gratitude and continuation are not the same thing. You believed the role was who you were, but the psyche was actually using it as scaffolding. The consequence of mistaking scaffolding for structure is paralysis when the work is finished. The mechanism is identity fusion, a temporary solution hardening into a definition. When the scaffolding is removed, the building stands or collapses on its own integrity. Here it stands. At this point, the most unsettling realization arrives without drama. Nothing is missing. The ache that once drove you toward others, toward explanation, toward endless attunement, has gone quiet. Not replaced. Not healed in the sentimental sense. Quiet. This quiet is not peace as consolation. It is peace as fact. Another turn reveals itself, often long after the major shifts have occurred. You believed the struggle was about love, but the psyche was actually resolving a question of authority. Who decides what you are allowed to feel, to want, to refuse? As long as that authority was externalized in parents, partners, systems, or ideals, the empath remained in survival mode. When authority returns to the self, survival loses its urgency. The consequence of this return is subtle but absolute. You no longer rush to be understood. You no longer rush to correct misinterpretation. You recognize that being misread is not the same as being erased. The mechanism is the decoupling of existence from recognition. You exist before you are perceived. This order is irreversible once known. There is a dream that sometimes marks this stage. You are walking through a familiar place, but the doors that once opened into crowded rooms now lead to empty spaces. The furniture is gone. The walls remain. You feel no panic. The dream is not about loss. It is about clearance. The psyche has emptied what no longer belongs. Outside, dawn threatens but does not arrive yet. The horizon lightens without spectacle. Frost begins to loosen its grip on the ground. You believed emptiness required filling, but the psyche was actually creating capacity. The consequence of resisting this is noise. The mechanism is fear of interiority, inherited from environments where inner life was dangerous or irrelevant. When that fear dissolves, interiority no longer feels like absence. In this state, old provocations fail. The comments that once pierced now glance off. Not because you have hardened, but because they no longer refer to anything central. Praise also loses its power. It lands, registers, and passes. The psyche does not cling. This is often mistaken by others for coldness. It is neutrality regained. There is an astronomical image that belongs here, one that does not flatter. A star does not adjust its gravity to accommodate passing bodies. It exerts what it is. Planets either find orbit or drift away. The star does not pursue them. It does not explain its mass. You believed relational harmony required constant adjustment. But the psyche was actually rediscovering that coherence generates its own order. The consequence is fewer but more stable bonds. The mechanism is the alignment of outer relation with inner structure. At this stage, guilt appears rarely, but when it does, it is easily recognized. It no longer disguises itself as virtue. It appears as a voice without authority, echoing a script whose language you now understand but no longer speak. The psyche listens without responding. Silence answers. Silence. There is no triumph here, no sense of arrival. What exists instead is finality of a particular kind. Certain doors do not reopen not because they are locked but because the need to pass through them has ended. You do not revisit explanations that once consumed years. You do not rehearse defenses for battles that no longer exist. The energy once bound in vigilance becomes available for living, though living now looks quieter than imagined. You believed vitality would express itself as enthusiasm, but the psyche experiences it as steadiness. The consequence is a life less dramatic but more inhabited. The mechanism is the cessation of inner conflict between persona and self. There is a final image, one that resists embellishment. A set of scales stands in used, not balanced. And used. The weighing is over because judgment is no longer required. What is present is present. What is absent is absent. The psyche no longer seeks permission to be what it is. Ash has cooled completely. Now what remains is mineral, no longer combustible. Salt lies where moisture once gathered. Iron rests without strain. The materials have settled into their nature. You believed the end of the old empath would feel like loss, but the psyche experiences it as relief without celebration. The consequence is gravity. The mechanism is the self seated where it always belonged. This authority does not argue with the past. It does not correct it. It simply no longer answers when summoned by obsolete signals. Family roles may call. Old dynamics may attempt re-entry through familiarity, nostalgia, or obligation. They find no access not because of resistance, but because the interface has been removed. Nothing replaces the old empath. There is no new identity to announce. There is only a person who no longer survives through self-betrayal. Sensitivity remains, but it is no longer conscripted. Empathy remains, but it is no longer compulsive. Love remains, but it is no longer proof of worth. The night gives way to morning without comment. Stone holds the warmth of yesterday's fire. The river continues, indifferent to who watches it. This is not hope. It is not reassurance. It is the fact of a psychic order restored. The self does not promise a gentler world. It promises nothing at all. It simply takes its seat. And from that seat the old contract cannot reach you anymore.